And we are live. All right, I am super excited about today's episode. We have Inga Wiele. Hopefully I said that right. And Inga and I met through the power of LinkedIn networking. Just we were talking about similar things and sort of ended up just hopping on a call. And so I've been on her podcast, and now here she is on our podcast. I think I was the first North American guest on your podcast, and you're the first European guest on our podcast. So we're super excited to have you.
Inga, second international guest, because we had somebody from Canada last week was our first.
That's right. So Inga is an author of a really cool book about design thinking. She has her own podcast called Leadership Kino, which is all about what leadership lessons we can learn from TV shows and movies, which is super fun. And she is a strategist and facilitator for a company called Gestaltenraum. Did I get that one right? Excellent. I'm doing my best with the German today. And we are just super excited, Inga, to have you on. And I'm going to ask you, my first question is, what's on your mind?
Yeah, this morning, I read this LinkedIn post from a woman I know who does design thinking as well, and she uses this marketing with I'm going to put artificial intelligence into design thinking, and for me, design thinking is the absolute opposite of artificial intelligence. It's really about real human intelligence. And I got into this back and forth with her,
So that's a really interesting topic. I mean, actually, maybe if you can start, maybe just give a little bit of a definition for the audience of how, what is design thinking from your perspective. But I'd love to talk more about that topic of how is AI going to play into this very important sort of approach to how we do innovation and all kinds of things.
For me, whenever you're in processes where you have a lot of ambiguity, and you do this as a team, and you need a unique problem-solving process, because usually all of us have our own individual problem-solving approaches, and then when we are in team situations and everybody starts with their own processes, then you usually get into trouble. And so for me, design thinking is like an operating mode for teams who work in highly ambiguous projects.
Oh, that makes total sense. So just to go back to your what was on your mind, do you see a role for AI in that process, and how will it play in that process?
I guess you can use it at several stages. So actually, once in a workshop, we did interviews, and so I sent the participants really on the street to ask questions to real people on the street. And when they come back, we do storytelling, so they tell the others what they've heard from their interview partners. And I had this one group who were talking about this American woman that they met on the street. And they really did all this. They said what she said and what her answers were. And then they finished and they said, actually, this American woman was ChatGPT.
Well, I think it's interesting that ChatGPT is an American woman. I mean, how should we interpret that?
I think they gave her a name. It was something like Sarah or whatever we assume Americans are called. First name?
Not Karen.
Did you feel like that was like a clever solution to the problem, or like, hey, you didn't really do the exercise?
It was pretty surprising, because it was the topic that they were researching was whether it makes sense to have like mini books on how do you call it, on how do you call books like that, like where you only have business stuff in? What's the genre of the book?
Oh,
Like a
business, I
Business
guess.
books. Yeah, would it make sense to have business books in a real small format? Do you know this in America, those small children books that
Yeah,
only like 10 pages or something like that?
yes.
And I think Sarah, the American woman, replied, "It could, it does not have to be a bad idea."
Okay, so I guess Sarah left it open.
But you know, it's funny you say that because there are a lot of, if you go out on Amazon now, there are a lot of what they call low content books out there, which I don't know. I mean, as somebody who's worked on a book, and then your book, I have your book. It's downstairs, so I can't like hold it up, but your book is just this beautiful book about the design thinking process and whatever. And it's just the way it it's the kind of book that you could have out on your coffee table. I mean, just amazing looking book, and it's and so forth. That I think, you know, having written a book, it's like this idea of like, we're just going to just, you know, dash off like a couple of, you know, LinkedIn articles worth of work and then toss it in and charge $10 for it. Feels a little like, you know, cheating, but I guess if it works, it works, you know.
I feel like we don't need to reinvent the low content book. I feel like it already existed.
So let me ask you a question back to AI in ambiguous situations and innovation specifically. Isn't it that AI is net what already exists and good at analyzing, summarizing? But here your ask is come up with some crazy ideas, right? So by definition, it needs to be a different form of input. And then AI may be able to help out and synthesizing or, you know, kind of assessing. Is that how you see it?
We just talked about low content, and I think speaking about low, it's probably, yes, exactly what you say. It's like digesting what's already there, but of course sometimes it comes up with surprising combinations of knowledge, and I'm very often surprised what ideas it sparks me when I prompt in ChatGPT. But when you want to have really original ideas that you have passions in, I mean, when you want to be passionate about what you are pursuing in your what you choose from the ideas, then I don't think that ChatGPT really gives you answers that spark passion.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting, Inga, as you're talking about that. So Inga and I, when we first started chatting on LinkedIn, we have a shared interest in this guy named John Boyd, and I won't geek out too much about John Boyd.
You do this all the time, Jeff.
We can use the whole thing, but you know, it's interesting, Inga. I'm guessing you're familiar with this, but he actually talks about this idea of like, how do you take a bunch of different ideas, deconstruct them, and put them together in a new way. And he talks about the idea of like, if you take the treads from a tractor and the handlebars from a bicycle and the outboard motor from a boat and so forth, and you put skis on it from a, you know, somebody who's, you know, on the mountain, on the slopes, you put all those things together, you get a snowmobile. And so it's an interesting question of how do you actually take a bunch of disparate things from different places and put them together in new ways. And so I don't know, we don't usually talk about that in terms of what ChatGPT does, but that's sort of what made me think of when you were talking about it creates these connections that may actually spur thinking about things in a different way. I think is kind of the way I think about, you know, whether it's ChatGPT or just the power of using some of the, you know, sort of design thinking, you know, the sort of divergent design thinking skills that people use for, you know, whatever, brainstorming and all those kinds of things. Is how do I actually start thinking about things in a different way and actually combining things in a different way?
Are you, when you're talking about design thinking, Inga, are you prototyping or is it mostly on paper? Like, what's the kind of process? Like, are you actually building things? Are you, you know, how does the process actually look in the way that you execute on it in the real world?
I would say basically it's got two big cycles, and the first one is the first understand the problem, and the second one is then solve it. And if I would go back to the ski mobile, I'm not sure whether ChatGPT could have created a ski mobile based on the needs that someone has, and I don't think whether ChatGPT would really understand the needs of someone
Right. I think that's
or a group of people. So for me, design thinking, I know there is a lot of hype about the whole brainstorming and prototyping, but the thing that when I got to know design thinking that really convinced me was that you spend a whole lot of time on understanding. And I'm not sure whether you're familiar with this Einstein quote, where
Yeah, I
he
was gonna
says, if I would have like 60 minutes time to solve a problem which can save the world or something like that, I would actually spend 55 minutes on understanding the problem. And I'm afraid people who use ChatGPT for understanding want to skip that step.
right. That's really interesting. I think that's a really interesting perspective. I think that it gets very. You're right. The reason that that's I guess maybe that's a little bit of the piece that's missing from what Boyd was talking about was, but you can't just take those things and throw them into a pile and get a snowmobile, right? You have to actually have a purpose, and actually, so it's interesting. Have you ever read, Inga? I can't remember we talked about it. There's a book called "Fall in Love with the Problem, Not the Solution," by a guy named Yuri Levine, where he basically talks about this idea of, I need to first, like you said, I need to first understand the problem, and then I'm going to throw some sort of, minimum viable, kind of prototype at it and see how people interact with it, and does it solve the problem? And if it doesn't solve the problem, what sometimes happened with the startups is they go, oh well, it didn't solve that problem, so I'm going to go find another problem. And what Yuri Levine says is, no, don't go find another problem. You found a problem, now change the solution to fix it. I think it's a really valuable way of thinking about that.
I mean, you're in marketing, and my husband actually sent me this Instagram reel this week of this really, really funny marketing guy. I think he's an American. I don't know his name, but it was really interesting. He was on stage and he was talking about advertising budgets used to be bigger, and that now, as they're not as big anymore, he says, when you're doing advertising, the result you get is not really the ad. The result you really get is a much deeper understanding of what your customers really are looking for. And he said that's what you need the big budget for.
Right. Right.
You don't need that for the result. It's really, he said, or the other thing that he said was, is like, if you write a master thesis, nobody reads the master's thesis after it's written. Usually you don't do that. You write it to learn. And there was the same guy, and I find it really interesting how he
it's fascinating because there's this weird thing, I think, that at least I've observed. To be interested, Elena, in your perspective on this as a fellow marketer, that I've observed is, I think that marketing has been slowly devolving into a technical function instead of a strategic function. And I think what that guy is talking about is exactly right. Sort of your Einstein quote is, the real power of marketers, historically, has been to really spend the time to understand what is the problem we're solving for our consumers and how can we talk about that problem. And now it's sort of like, oh, can you do search?
Yeah, automate the whole thing. Yeah. And you can automate and use many good tools, but nobody can solve that whole understanding of what problem are you trying to solve and what does this customer want. And back to the advertising budget, I wish they were allocated that way, to understand the customer, 90% to shoot the ad 10. But you go look at the Super Bowl and they spent the money on special effects and endorsements and whatnot. Right. So it's still not quite where we'd wish it was.
I have a question for you, Inga. when you go into companies and start talking about this approach, the 55-5 ratio, et cetera, do you get resistance? Do you get, are people like, no, this is not how we operate? Or what's the reaction to this thinking approach?
Usually people tell me that they already know what the customers want and that they've been in business so long that they don't need to talk to more customers. It's really interesting. And then especially when you go into teams and then you ask, I like to ask people, so if this is clear to you, why doesn't everybody of you write down what they think the customer needs without looking at what the other writes? And then afterwards we read it out to each other aloud, and and they're usually surprised how different their knowledge about customer and what they think about the needs of their customers is.
Yeah. No, I think that's.
And in that scheme of thing, Inga, who usually has the best knowledge? The worker, the boss, or the middle manager?
What do you think, Elena? What I answer?
The worker. Unless that boss has spent their entire career in the industry, there is some people who have just brilliant notion at their fingertips where they have, processed. But that would be my guess.
I think it depends whether the founder is still in the company. What I find that founders usually have a real good understanding of their customers, whereas if you have like employed managers, it's usually either sales is usually really good. I mean, Eric, aren't you in sales? So I find
Not really.
Not really? Okay, sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
I remember one talk between you guys where you talked about
I
sales.
just said sales a lot, but
I'm the one who's not in marketing and sales and whatever, and I just make stuff up.
Okay, so I got that wrong. But
no, it's okay.
Most people are, if they're not just focused on fast closing of deals, they're usually really good in understanding the customers. And I'm very often surprised by like help functions like secretaries. People who talk on the phone. Like I had this group of architects who did a team meeting with me where they just wanted to do some fun stuff. And so I was thinking about it. So they wanted to learn a bit about design thinking, and they had like 4 hours, and they said, do something fun with us. And so we live in a tourist spot here at the north coast of Germany, and I gave them the task to invent some new event or some new fun location that the tourists in this area could go to. And upfront they asked me whether their team assistant should participate or not, because they were like, she's not doing design thinking, And I said, why not? I mean, she's there anyway. So what should she do in the meantime? Walk alone at the beach? Or I said, I would invite her. And in the end, the owner of the company, of the architecture company, came to me and he said, I'm so happy that we involved her, because we were so surprised. We were thinking about something that probably our customers, our clients would like. And she contributed so much knowledge about the family situations, where they work, what experiences they have. And he said, that's probably because she's the first one at the phone.
Right.
He answers the phone, and people tell everything to her before she can dispatch it.
Yeah, I think there's also this tendency to groupthink, to assume like you said, you assume you know what the client wants. But there's also I find there's this incredible capacity to rationalize why, when you get information that says you didn't know what you should be doing, why that person who's telling you that information, even if it's a potential client, is wrong about what they're saying. Right? There's an incredible potential to rationalize away.
Yeah.
Know.
It's interesting because, Eric, we've run into this a lot where, you bring a new idea to a company, whatever, and almost immediately there's always somebody in the background going, yeah, these guys don't know what they're talking about. And it's sort of a backward kind of view, because it's like, well, wait a second, you're so mired in this thing. And oftentimes is, the reason we're talking to somebody is because whatever they're doing isn't working. It's just like, well, maybe bringing in a diverse view or something new would be helpful. And so actually I was going to ask you, how can you, I think a lot of companies, they miss that it's not that they don't understand the consumer and what they need. It's that the consumer needs change over time, and they don't learn as those things change. And so have you been able to sort of use design thinking or some of the workshops and things that you do to get companies to sort of get out of this stuck view of we have to keep doing the same thing that we were always doing?
I find that this is something that usually takes quite some time.
Uh-huh.
So initially, when you start working with them, and I don't bring ideas to them. I bring an approach to them so that they find ideas, and then I work with this German festival company that do the world's biggest metal festival, and we did an innovation lab on the festival ground in 2019, and it was really interesting because they were way ahead of what their fans asked for. So they were talking about different kind of festival food, different accommodations, future music, digitalization, and the fans were all like, we don't need that. We want the old festival. We want to keep it as it is. And at the same time, if you don't invent new things, and they're really innovative. They invented a lot of new formats, and like the way they do the camping has changed, and now people buy all that. So the camping offers are usually sold out within hours.
Right.
Even though a lot of people say this is not what we expect, this is not true metal anymore, and so they're sometimes also opposed to it, but in the end they use it.
Well, yeah, that's really interesting. Like, like that whole thing that I think people say about like the iPhone, like nobody would have said, before there was an iPhone, that they wanted an iPhone. So you really have to understand the problem almost devoid from the solution and then work towards it. I'm going to switch gears for a second because, as promised, we always have ChatGPT ask some questions. And and I usually ask the question, would you like thought-provoking or absurd first? So or I can just pick.
Let's start with absurd.
All right. Let's see. All right. Well, this one's kind of goofy. I don't know if it's absurd or thought-provoking. If you could design a design thinking workshop for aliens, what would be the first question you would ask them? Almost. That was thought-provoking, not absurd, or both.
Or neither.
You can also say pass if you don't.
Do you have climate change on Volcania?
Right.
Volcania sounds like it's pretty, at least the warming part's already taken care of.
No, I would want to know why they are green.
Oh, that's also a good question. Is the sun different so that you get a green tan, or?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know. Maybe the question would be, what are the biggest problems that you can't solve on your planet that we would help?
That's what I thought when I said climate change.
What's
Have you solved climate change?
So here I'm going to
I think a human being on your research team would actually add to the conversation.
So the next one I'm gonna ask sort of combines what you were talking about with the festivals and your work. So imagine design thinking were a theme park. What would be the most popular ride, and what would it do? That might have been absurd as well. Sorry.
That's absurd because I'm always surprised that people like those really awful rides. I'm asking myself, why would anyone do this voluntarily? You would never get me on one of those. I actually think the most popular ride would probably be the Yellowstone rodeo ride.
Any rationale? That would be just because, or
people love the show Yellowstone. I don't know about America, but they do love the show, and they love the guy Jimmy Herdstrom, or what's his name, and he does those crazy rides on the rodeos. I mean, I always ask myself, why would anyone do something like that? But people seem to like this crazy stuff.
I actually think that in the context of innovation, a crazy rodeo pushes you out of a comfort zone.
Yeah.
And in order to be innovative, and at some point you just have to throw up various different ideas, right? And not be afraid to,
As long as the rodeo ride doesn't throw you off too much.
Have you been to Disney World in Anaheim?
I've never been in it. I've been near it. But
Florida, not Anaheim.
Yeah, I was in Florida, and I was in Anaheim. It was almost 30 years ago. So I mean, and they had this Indiana Jones ride where you were driving in a Jeep. I thought that was really cool. You were like in a Jeep on a rail, of course. And then that scene where this giant rock rolls towards Indiana Jones, and they actually really built that. And you see this giant stone ball rolling onto you, and you think like, that they're not killing you. So, but up till the last moment, I was like, how are they going to solve this? And so it really the car dives down underneath this ball and then comes back up on the other side. And I thought, from my perspective, that was the coolest ride I was ever on.
Have you in the US, and I don't know if they're still as popular, and I'm not sure how they sort of fared during the pandemic, but they're all over the place. They're called escape rooms, where you so I mean, I don't know, that was sort of what my brain went to, like, how do you actually create some design problems where people have to, essentially solve design problems in order to get out their trash.
Did you hear that Volkswagen, the German car manufacturer, VW, is doing that to train their people in electrical engines or electrical mechanics, because they have to train a huge amount of people to come from the conventional motors to the electric motors now, and they actually do use escape room type of training.
Like, you have to learn this in order to get out, kind of thing.
Definitely.
I have a question going back to the aliens. And actually, that's a serious question, but you brought it up when we were talking about the aliens before. How does the design thinking, how can design thinking change our approach to global warming or climate change, I guess is more the more common term. Like, how are people using it now? Why isn't it working as fast and as well as it could? Although I did see yesterday that Europe has something like the EU is now was covering about 30% of its energy with renewables. But I don't know. Here's an example. We, at least in the US, we're so focused on this sort of centralized energy delivery capacity. And so all of the solutions need to be huge, right? You need a hydroelectric plant, a nuclear power plant, a coal burning plant, whatever it is. But actually, it strikes me that the sun, for example, is one of the most distributed, by its nature, distributed power sources that we could possibly imagine. And yet we think of it still in terms of like this centralized delivery. And I think, obviously solar power is slightly different in that can be put on an individual house. But even then, we just think about everything as having to be kind of centralized even within that house context. How do you get people out of that sort of mentality, maybe not that specific mentality, but that mentality of like, this is how we've done it before, and this is how we have to keep doing it. And instead of thinking about solutions that might actually be different, but solve a problem like global, climate change, et cetera, from a different perspective.
I mean, Europe goes way back when you look at renewable energy. I remember that when I was a kid, we already had this discussion. And then I think when we talk about Europe and energy topic, you always have to keep in mind that the current generation who manages a lot of or is in politics has experienced the Chernobyl catastrophe. And I think that was, people realized that nuclear power is probably not the best way to provide energy in the future. And because in Europe, everything there is a more scarcity probably also. We have less big forests. We don't have as much, how do you call it? Resources in the like oil or anything. So and it's densely populated. So I think Chernobyl really made people think. I mean, I was 16 when that happened, and I think for my generation and a big part of Europe, that was really a mind-changing event. Up to that, we always had the Cold War, which was a threat, but Chernobyl just brought a different dimension. And there's still a big controversy in Europe about how we are going to provide energy in the future. And there are a lot of people who think we should go back to nuclear power or more coal, and they're always comparing China. China's building a lot of coal power plants at the moment. But at the same time, I think there is this unifying event of Chernobyl, which really made us very aware how close everything is. And I mean, even though it was in Ukraine, the wind brought it over to whole Europe. So I think people went to Spain in order to flee from the nuclear pollution.
So Inga, we have, as promised, this half hour has flown by. We're at the end of we're actually a little over. Although somebody recently, I think one of Jeff and my parents said that we keep ticking it up a little bit. So it's getting closer to 40 minutes lately, but that's okay. So we always go around and ask everybody to say one thing that they want to leave the audience with. And it's part of our just glee at watching people squirm, I guess, to always ask the guests to go first so they don't have any time to think about it. So what is one thing that you want to leave the audience with?
You should really learn design thinking.
Yeah.
It's changed my life. I mean, that was the original topic of the talk. We didn't talk that much about design thinking even. And then the other thing is really what I really like also about the way you approach this. I feel like you're listening, and probably that's the most important about design thinking, is learn to listen.
Absolutely. Well, before I jump in with my one thing, which is going to build on your one thing, Inga, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Well, you can look at my LinkedIn profile. That's how I got to know Jeff, and I think that's probably the best way. Just send me a request for for connection, and then
Awesome.
we'll be in touch.
Well, very, very good. I actually am going to build on, we did say we were going to talk about how design thinking impacts your life. And actually, one of the things we didn't talk about, I just literally read a book, Inga, that I meant to recommend to you if you haven't come across it, called Designing Your Life, which is actually all about applying design thinking to your life. But I think, this whole idea where you start with, how do I first really understand the problem that I'm trying to solve, develop solutions, try them out, and not get stuck with one solution, and just keep sort of triangulating until you kind of get to something that works, is a way of thinking that, to your point, it applies as much to your life as it does to innovating some new product. So I think it's just a really powerful sort of approach to pretty much almost anything. So I will pass it over to Elena.
So happily, I definitely second and use that approach. And my big takeaway, both for professional design thinking and in life, and things change. And your customer needs change, and your own needs change. And every once in a while, you just have to do this kind of revisions. Are we still on the same page with what we have offered? And if we're not, understand what needs to be fine-tuned and stepped up.
Yeah.
And I'm going to leave with two things. One is this concept that you brought up with the anecdote you told about the administrative person coming in. The fact that bringing in people who think differently and bringing different perspectives in is really essential to just knocking yourself out of this sort of group think and sort of limiting your thought process. The other thing is, I really appreciate that you brought Einstein in as somebody who has shared both on both sides of the German-US equation. In fact, I don't know whether we could probably get at a long conversation about who gets to own Einstein, but at least that we represent the two countries. So, and I really like that concept that you brought up of you got to think more about the problem and then bring the solution. It's very easy sometimes to put things together without knowing what and why you're putting together. So thank you again. This was fantastic episode, and thanks for joining us. And thanks for being our first overseas international.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It was great fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.